Picture this. You're standing in a chamber of marble and shadow deep within the ancient city of Alexandria. The year is 89 BC, more than 2 centuries after the death of Alexander the Great. Yet the man's presence still commands fear and reverence. Roman officials, dispatched to inspect the royal tomb, gather before a sarcophagus unlike any they have ever seen. It isn't gold as legend once proclaimed, nor entirely stone. Before them rests a coffin of crystal clear enough that one can peer inside and confront the preserved form of the conqueror who reshaped the known world. The Romans, pragmatic and suspicious by nature, had expected bones, perhaps shreds of cloth, a dust-worn relic of a man long dead. Instead, when the lid was carefully lifted, they gasped as if they had disturbed a sleeping god. Alexander's body did not resemble a corpse at all. His skin still bore a faint tone of life. His features, sharp and youthful, had not dissolved into decay. His hair still framed his head as though combed only days earlier. To their horror, the great commander appeared not dead, but merely asleep. His eyes closed in silence, his body unnaturally intact after more than 200 years. For generations, tales had circulated that Alexander's corpse resisted the corruption of time. Some whispered that his body, like that of a pharaoh, had been preserved by master embalmers. Others insisted this incorruptibility was proof of divine parentage, that he truly was the son of Zeus, Ammon, a semi-god whose body the earth refused to claim. But the men in that chamber could not afford to indulge myth. They saw with their own eyes something uncanny, a preserved body that defied every natural expectation, and it chilled them. One Roman writer described how when the glass-like lid was replaced with a plainer covering, a shiver passed among the officials. They did not speak of it openly, but many feared they had gazed upon something forbidden. If bones and dust signified the natural end of men, then what were they to make of a body that endured as though immortal? To understand why this moment struck such terror, one must remember who Alexander was. At his death in 323 BC, he had been more than a king. He was a living myth, a man who crossed deserts, toppled empires, and carried Greek arms to the edges of India. His very name had become synonymous with conquest. And now, centuries later, his body confronted the Romans with the suggestion that he had conquered even death. Yet, beneath the awe lay something darker. The reports of Alexander's incorruptibility passed down by ancient embalmers and visiting dignitaries contained strange details. His skin had not turned to ash grey. His face seemed still flushed with a faint warmth. His flesh resisted decay even in the punishing heat of Babylon, where his death had first been declared. Some accounts claimed his body temperature fluctuated as though still capable of mysterious inner life. The Romans, skeptical but disturbed, began to wonder whether the conqueror's death had been quite what history described. The crystal coffin itself symbolized more than preservation. It was political theater. In Alexandria, rulers understood the power of spectacle. By displaying Alexander's body in transparent splendor, successive dynasties had turned him into an eternal relic. Pilgrims and kings alike traveled to gaze upon him to confirm with their own eyes that the conqueror of the world remained untouched by decay. In that chamber, life and death blurred into a disturbing illusion, a body preserved so well it mocked the natural order. Imagine the silence in that room as the Romans stared at Alexander's preserved face. They had come expecting to manage relics, perhaps strip a golden coffin for Rome's treasuries. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to a mystery greater than treasure. What they saw whispered of secrets hidden in the dying days of Babylon, secrets that stretched across centuries and haunted every generation that sought to explain them. Was this miracle the achievement of ancient science, embalming so advanced it rivaled modern chemistry? Was it the product of political necessity, a carefully crafted image to maintain the divine aura of a fallen king? Or was it something stranger still, a consequence of Alexander's own death? A death unlike any other in the ancient world. That crystal coffin glittering in lamplight forced every man in that chamber to question not only the fate of a king, but the very meaning of mortality. The conqueror had been declared dead 2 centuries before. Yet, here he lay defiant, his body preserved, as if mocking the physicians who once pronounced his end. The sight disturbed them deeply because it raised a question too dreadful to speak aloud. What if Alexander had not truly died when the world believed he had? The mystery of Alexander's incorruptible body cannot be understood without returning to the night when his downfall began. It was June of 323 BC, in the royal city of Babylon, where heat pressed down like a furnace. Alexander, only 32 years old, yet master of the largest empire the world had ever known, gathered with his companions for a lavish banquet. The mood was festive, yet beneath the laughter hung the fatigue of years of unbroken campaigning. At some point during the revelry, Alexander raised a cup of wine, strong, almost scalding in its intensity. He had always been a formidable drinker, able to outlast companions in feasts that lasted from sunset until dawn. But this time was different. No sooner had he swallowed than a sharp cry escaped his lips. Witnesses later said he clutched his abdomen as though struck by an arrow, his knuckles whitening with the force of his grip. The hall fell into stunned silence as the invincible conqueror doubled over in agony. This was no ordinary stomach ache. Ancient sources describe his pain as sudden and overwhelming, a torment that forced even hardened generals to rush to his side in panic. Some believed it was poison slipped into his wine by an enemy bold enough to strike at the very heart of empire. Others whispered it was divine punishment, a god's retribution for the blood spilled on his relentless campaigns. But in that moment, speculation gave way to fear. Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, was visibly, terrifyingly human. Over the next hours and days, his condition worsened. His once tireless frame faltered under waves of fever that came and went with cruel irregularity. He spoke of searing pain in his belly, pain so sharp it seemed to hollow him out from within. His strength, the same strength that had carried him across deserts and over mountains, began to ebb away. And yet his mind remained astonishingly clear. Even as his body betrayed him, he issued orders, dictated plans, and reassured those around him that the empire's work was not yet done. The contrast was startling. The conqueror who had charged at the head of phalanxes now lay confined to a bed sharp-eyed, but immobile. A general trapped inside the prison of his own body. Babylon in June was no place for illness. The air hung heavy with dust and heat. Insects swarmed, and the stagnant waters around the city bred fevers and disease. Alexander's companions summoned the finest physicians from across Mesopotamia and beyond. Remedies were applied herbs, ground into bitter pastes poultices, pressed against his burning skin, bloodletting to balance his humours. None of it worked. Each attempt seemed only to highlight the helplessness of men when faced with a sickness they could not name. The accounts of his suffering spread quickly among the camp. Soldiers who had marched with him from Greece to India gathered outside the palace demanding news. They refused to believe their leader could be so vulnerable. When allowed to glimpse him, they saw not a corpse in waiting, but a man whose eyes still burned with command even as his body grew limp. Some later wrote that he lifted his hand in greeting, fingers trembling yet purposeful, a silent reassurance to the men who adored him. The banquet that had begun in laughter became the opening scene of a tragedy. The empire held together by Alexander's will alone suddenly faced the unthinkable. What if its master fell? For the generals clustered at his bedside, every wince and cry of pain carried not just the weight of a man's suffering, but the looming collapse of a kingdom stretched across continents. Looking back, modern readers can see the outlines of something stranger than poison. The pain, the fever, the paralysis creeping upward while his mind stayed clear, all hint at an affliction beyond the comprehension of ancient medicine. Yet, for those in Babylon, no such diagnosis existed. All they knew was that their king, who had faced war elephants and stormed impregnable fortresses, was now battling an invisible enemy from within his own flesh. It began at a banquet, a simple sip of wine, a sudden cry, and the shattering of a myth. The conqueror of the known world was no longer untouchable. He was mortal. And in that mortality began one of history's most haunting mysteries. The days after the banquet revealed an illness that defied everything Alexander's physicians understood about life and death. His condition followed a pattern that seemed both deliberate and cruel. The fever rose and fell in waves, scorching him one moment and leaving him shivering the next. His abdomen remained a source of agony, but then something even stranger began to unfold. His body slowly betrayed him, piece by piece, as though an unseen hand were tightening invisible chains around him. It started with weakness in his legs. The same legs that had carried him across deserts and up fortress walls now struggled to bear his weight. Then the weakness climbed upward. His arms, once strong enough to draw a bow in battle, grew heavy, reluctant to obey his will. Each day brought a new loss. Yet, through it all, Alexander's mind shone unbroken. He spoke with clarity, remembered every detail, and continued issuing instructions as if planning another campaign. This paradox terrified those around him. How could a man remain so lucid while his body failed so utterly to ancient physicians? Illness was usually accompanied by delirium, confusion, or a dimming of the senses. But Alexander was not confused. He gave orders to his generals about troop movements, succession, and religious offerings, all with the same commanding tone he had used on battlefields. His body crumbled. His mind remained sharp as tempered bronze. One witness described how he summoned his officers, speaking to them from his bed while unable to lift even a finger. His eyes moved deliberately, scanning their faces, and though his voice grew weaker, every word was chosen with the precision of a man accustomed to command. This image, the greatest conqueror in history, lying immobile yet ruling with his gaze alone, burned itself into the memory of those present. The imperial doctors tried everything. They bled him to balance his humours. They pressed poultices of herbs against his chest and abdomen. They burned incense, thought to drive out illness, even whispered incantations to ward off malevolent spirits. But none of their methods slowed the relentless progression. The paralysis crept steadily upward, swallowing his body inch by inch, yet sparing the mind. To the soldiers outside the palace gates, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Alexander had been cursed by the gods for claiming divine parentage. Others claimed he had been poisoned by rivals who feared his next campaign. And still others whispered that he was not dying at all, but entering a supernatural state, crossing the boundary between mortal and divine. Inside the palace, reality was more dreadful than rumor. The physicians knew they were watching something they had never encountered before. They leaned over him, checking for breath, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening for the faintest sound. And Alexander, aware of their scrutiny, could still speak, though each word required monumental effort. Imagine the torment of being Alexander in those days. His mind alive thoughts, racing memories of campaigns and plans for the future vivid as ever. Yet his body, the instrument of his destiny, slipping beyond his control. He who had charged at the head of cavalry into enemy lines, who had scaled fortress walls under fire, who had tamed empires with sword and strategy, now found himself unable to lift a hand or rise from his bed. The generals and companions around him tried to mask their fear, but they knew the truth. Their leader was trapped within his own flesh. Each day, they watched for signs of improvement, and each day hope slipped further away. To those who believed in omens, the message was clear. Alexander, the man who had been unstoppable, was being undone, not by an enemy's spear, but by his own body. This was no ordinary sickness. It was a prison without walls, a slow paralysis that left his intellect untouched. And it raised a question that lingered in every silent chamber of the palace. If the greatest man alive could be reduced to a mind imprisoned in a dying body, what did that say about the fragility of all human greatness? The conqueror of worlds was now conquered by something invisible, a sickness that no army could defeat, no physician could banish, and no god seemed willing to explain. And then came the most unnerving detail of all. For 6 days after his supposed death, his corpse showed no signs of decay under the merciless heat of a Babylonian summer. In the centuries that followed, scholars, physicians, and poets debated the cause. Was it poison slipped into his wine by rivals eager to seize the empire? Was it divine punishment from offended gods exacting vengeance upon a man who claimed descent from Zeus, Ammon? Or was it the culmination of years of relentless campaigning exhaustion and wounds finally catching up to him? Modern medicine, however, has opened a darker possibility. In the 21st century, researchers began comparing the symptoms recorded by ancient historians with known medical conditions. Among them was Dr. Catherine Hall, a physician and scholar, who proposed what is now known as the nightmarish theory. According to her analysis, Alexander may have suffered from a rare neurological condition, Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré is an autoimmune disorder in which the body's defenses, instead of protecting, turn against the nervous system. The result is what physicians describe as ascending paralysis. It begins subtly with weakness in the feet or legs, then climbs relentlessly upward, seizing the muscles of the body one by one. Within days, a man once vigorous can find his limbs useless, his chest tightening, his throat unresponsive. In the most severe cases, the paralysis reaches the muscles that control breathing. the victim appears still motionless and lifeless, yet remains fully conscious within. This, historians now believe, mirrors Alexander's final days. He was alert, capable of speech, even issuing orders while his body failed. He did not slip into delirium or unconsciousness as poison victims often did. Instead, he remained aware, trapped in a shell that no longer obeyed him. To his companions, this was bewildering. To us, it is chillingly recognizable. The implications are profound. If Alexander truly succumbed to Guillain Barré, then the declaration of his death on June 11th, 323 BC, may have been premature. His doctors, lacking the instruments of modern medicine, tested for signs of life in the ways available to them. They checked his breath by holding mirrors or feathers near his mouth. They pressed their fingers to his neck to feel for a pulse. They studied his eyes for movement. But in cases of severe paralysis, these tests could easily fail. A man could breathe so faintly that no mirror fogged. A pulse could weaken until no fingertip could detect it. Eyes could fix unblinking, though the mind behind them remained alert. To the physicians of Babylon, Alexander appeared dead. In truth, he may have been locked inside his own body, aware of everything yet powerless to reveal it. This diagnosis also explains the second great mystery, his incorruptible corpse. In the blistering Mesopotamian heat, a body should have shown signs of decay within hours. Yet, Alexander's remained lifelike for nearly a week. Ancient sources marveled that his skin retained its color, his features stayed sharp, and his flesh refused to darken. The priests and embalmers arriving from Egypt declared it a miracle, a sign of divinity. But if Alexander had not truly died, if his heart still beat faintly, if his body was still technically alive, then the absence of decay makes perfect sense. The conqueror had not yet crossed fully into death, and so nature's processes had not yet claimed him. The nightmarish theory casts a long shadow over history itself. Alexander's alleged final words, "To the strongest," were said to determine the course of empire, sparking the wars of the Diadochi that fractured his realm into rival kingdoms. But if he was locked in paralysis, those words may have been imagined, invented, or garbled by others seeking legitimacy. Entire centuries of bloodshed could have been built on the silence of a man who could not speak. It also reframes his legendary incorruptibility. For generations, pilgrims traveled to Alexandria to see his preserved body in its crystal coffin, convinced they were gazing on proof of his divinity. Yet, what if this preservation was not supernatural at all, but the grim result of premature embalming applied to a body not entirely dead? Honey resins and oils were applied to flesh that still contained the faint spark of life. The embalmers, thinking they were preparing a corpse, may have been finishing the slow work of an illness. That possibility is almost too cruel to imagine. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known, a man who had crossed deserts, stormed cities, and declared himself son of a god, may have ended his life trapped in a body mistaken for dead, enduring days of awareness while embalming knives drew near. His empire dissolved around him. His generals plotted in the shadows, and history itself moved forward, all while Alexander lay silently imprisoned in flesh. This is the nightmarish theory, that Alexander the Great did not simply die, but endured something worse than death: the loss of voice, the paralysis of power, the consciousness of a man watching his empire unravel while he himself was embalmed alive. It is a reminder that even the strongest are not beyond the reach of frailty, and that history's greatest mysteries may sometimes conceal history's greatest horrors. When Alexander was finally pronounced dead on June 11th, 323 BC, the grief that swept through Babylon was unlike anything the empire had ever known. His soldiers, hardened men who had marched across deserts and bled on distant battlefields, wept openly outside the palace gates. Yet, amidst their sorrow, an eerie detail emerged, one that defied both nature and reason. Days passed, and his body showed no signs of decay. In the sweltering Mesopotamian summer, with temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a corpse should have swollen, discolored, and reeked within hours. But Alexander's body did none of these things. Witnesses swore that his skin retained its color, his features remained serene, and his form looked more like a man in slumber than one who had crossed the threshold of death. The royal physicians, stunned, recorded this anomaly with careful precision. 6 days after his supposed death, his body still looked untouched. Egyptian embalmers summoned to prepare him for the long journey home were equally baffled. They described what they called a lifelike warmth in his flesh. His body temperature seemed to fluctuate as though he were not fully gone. For the Greeks and Macedonians, this strange preservation took on immediate meaning. Alexander was not merely a king, he was divine. In their culture, incorruptibility was a sign of godhood, a proof that the mortal frame had been claimed by the heavens. The soldiers who filed past his bier whispered prayers not of farewell, but of worship, convinced they stood before a man elevated beyond humanity. Yet, beneath the reverence lurked a darker possibility. What if his body resisted decay because it had not truly died? Modern scholars who accept the Guillain-Barré hypothesis argue that the absence of decomposition was not miracle, but biology. The body of a man who still clung faintly to life, his slowed metabolism delaying the onset of decay. If true, then what the embalmers saw as a sign of godhood may have been evidence of something far more harrowing. Even without modern theories, the ancient world sensed something uncanny. The Babylonian summer was a cruel environment, unkind even to the living, let alone the dead. Flies and insects thrived in the stagnant canals. Rot came quickly, yet Alexander lay in state for days, while emissaries and generals argued over his empire, and still his form remained strangely untouched. The soldiers outside began to circulate stories. Some said that Zeus Ammon, the god, who had once declared Alexander his son, preserved him with divine fire. Others believed his body contained a mysterious natural quality, proof that he was destined to transcend mortality. Still others whispered in fear perhaps their king had not truly departed, and the physicians had made a dreadful mistake. These rumors carried weight far beyond Babylon's walls. In Macedonia and Greece, the news that Alexander's body had resisted corruption reinforced the cult of his divinity. Coins and images soon portrayed him with the horns of Ammon, not merely as conqueror, but as God incarnate. His preserved body became a political weapon, a sign that his rule did not end with death. Whoever controlled that body controlled the aura of Alexander's immortality. But for those who stood at his side in Babylon, the sight was less reassuring than unsettling. They had watched him weaken, had heard his last words, or what they believed to be his last words. And now they saw a body that refused to decay, staring back at them with uncanny lifelikeness. In that stillness lay the seed of one of history's most chilling mysteries. Was Alexander truly gone? Or was he trapped in a liminal state, alive to the world, yet unable to move, speak, or escape? What they interpreted as a miracle may in truth have been a medical tragedy, a man imprisoned within his body while the world prepared to bury him. The image of Alexander that history often preserves is one of tireless vigor, a young man with the energy to march thousands of miles, lead cavalry charges headlong into enemy lines, and endure wounds that would have felled lesser men. He was the embodiment of strength, both physical and mental. Yet, beneath that heroic figure lay subtle frailties that ancient observers either overlooked or chose to ignore. Clues to these hidden weaknesses emerge not in medical records, for none survive, but in art or coinage, and the scattered descriptions of those who saw him in life. Many depictions of Alexander show his head held at a curious angle, a tilt that later artists imitated so faithfully it became a hallmark of his image. For centuries, scholars debated whether this was an artistic flourish, a symbol of his unique character. But modern medical historians suggest another explanation. The tilt may have been caused by a congenital spinal condition. One theory points to Klippel-Feil syndrome, a rare disorder in which certain cervical vertebrae are fused, shortening the neck and limiting mobility. Coins struck during Alexander's reign show an unusually thick neck and asymmetry in his face, details unlikely to be accidental. Some sculptures, too, reveal irregularities in the way his shoulders and head align. While ancient artists sometimes stylized features, the consistency of these details suggests they reflected reality. If true, Alexander carried a spinal deformity from birth. Though it never stopped him from fighting or riding it, might have left him vulnerable to certain strains, perhaps making his nervous system more susceptible to collapse later in life. His perpetual head tilt, so iconic that it became part of his legend, may in fact have been a lifelong reminder of his hidden fragility. There were other signs. Contemporary accounts note that Alexander sometimes suffered from fevers, particularly after long marches. Some described his eyes as uneven, one larger than the other, which could indicate neurological irregularities. Others hinted at an occasional limp or stiffness, though such remarks were often drowned out by the myth of his invincibility. These vulnerabilities did not prevent him from becoming one of history's most relentless campaigners, but they add a new layer to his story. Imagine the psychological burden to lead armies across Asia he had to project, unshakable strength, even as his own body may have carried reminders of imperfection. He cultivated an aura of divine favor, claiming descent from Zeus Ammon in part to overshadow these human flaws. And yet, those very weaknesses may have played a role in his final days. Modern medicine teaches that autoimmune disorders like Guillain-Barré syndrome can strike individuals already stressed by genetic predispositions or prior physical strain. Alexander's relentless lifestyle, constant campaigning, repeated injuries, the stress of command and exposure to exotic diseases may have combined with these hidden frailties to trigger the catastrophic illness that brought him down. It is a cruel irony. The man who appeared to embody invincibility may have carried within him the seeds of his undoing, his body strained by years of war and marked by silent irregularities, proved vulnerable at the very moment when the empire he created needed him most. For his contemporaries, these flaws went unnoticed or were absorbed into the legend. The tilt of his head was interpreted as a mark of nobility. His fevers were seen as signs of divine fire. His scars from battle were tokens of courage. But for modern historians, piecing together the medical puzzle, these same signs form a pattern that makes his sudden collapse less mysterious and far more human. The great conqueror's final weakness was not the spear or sword of an enemy, but the frailty inscribed in his very body, a fragility masked by legend until the night Babylon claimed him. When the physicians of Babylon finally declared Alexander the Great dead, the responsibility of preserving his body passed into the hands of those who were considered the finest mortuary specialists in the world, the Egyptian embalmers. These were men whose craft was ancient, even by the standards of the 4th century BC, guardians of techniques that had safeguarded pharaohs for over 2 millennia. To be summoned for the body of Alexander was not only a professional honor, but a political necessity. For his corpse was no ordinary remains, it was the physical vessel of a man who had claimed divinity, the anchor of an empire already teetering on the edge of collapse. The embalmers arrived in Babylon with their tools, oils, and sacred knowledge. Their methods were part ritual, part science, developed in the dry sands of the Nile Valley, where preservation was both a spiritual and practical art. They employed honey, a substance still prized today for its antibacterial qualities. Honey not only sweetened food, but sealed wounds and staved off rot. When spread across the body, it created an inhospitable environment for decay. Alongside honey, they carried resins of cedar and pine aromatic substances imported from distant mountains, as well as myrrh and frankincense. Luxury imports from Arabia. These were not chosen for fragrance alone. Modern chemical analysis has confirmed that such resins contain antimicrobial agents that slow the processes of decomposition. Natron, a naturally occurring salt from Egyptian desert lakes, would also have been a vital tool absorbing moisture from tissues. Linen strips washed and soaked in preservative mixtures were prepared to bind and cocoon the body. The embalmers understood that the key to immortality lay in dryness, chemistry, and ritual precision. And yet, when they approached Alexander, they encountered something deeply unsettling. The sources that describe this moment speak with an unease that later generations could not ignore. 6 days had passed since his supposed death, and still his body showed no signs of the decay expected in Babylon's suffocating heat. His skin, witnesses said, had not darkened or shriveled. His features remained serene, almost regal. Some even whispered that faint warmth seemed to linger in his flesh, as though life had not fully fled. To the embalmers trained to recognize the stages of death, this must have been bewildering. To his soldiers and companions, the preservation was a miracle. They saw proof that their king was no ordinary man, but touched by the gods. To the embalmers, however, the task before them was urgent, for the generals pressed for speed. The empire could not afford indecision. The body of Alexander had to be prepared quickly for transport and display. In the eyes of those who ruled, hesitation was dangerous. It risked rumors, rebellion, and political collapse. Modern historians now suggest that what those embalmers observed was not miracle, but medicine, or rather a medical tragedy. Guillain-Barré syndrome, if indeed Alexander suffered from it, could have left him paralyzed, his breathing shallow, his heartbeat imperceptible to ancient methods. The physicians of Babylon lacked stethoscopes, lacked any understanding of neurological paralysis. They judged life by breath and motion, and Alexander had neither. To them, he was gone. But, in truth, his mind may have lingered trapped in silence, while his body still resisted the onset of decay. If that was the case, then the horrific reality is almost unthinkable. The embalmers may have begun their work on a man who was still alive. Imagine Alexander unable to move or speak, as honey was poured over his skin, as blades opened his flesh, as organs were removed, and cavities filled with resin. Imagine the conqueror of the known world, who had stared down war elephants and stormed fortified cities, enduring the ultimate helplessness, cut apart under the assumption that he was already dead. The thought is unbearable, and yet it explains so much. The extraordinary preservation that later awed Romans and pilgrims may have been the result of beginning embalming on tissues that had not yet begun to decompose. Honey and resin applied to a body with a faint pulse would have sealed it against decay with astonishing effectiveness. The timing, tragic as it was, created the illusion of a miracle. The political dimension cannot be ignored. Alexander's generals were already maneuvering for power. Ptolemy Seleucus and Perdiccas needed a preserved body to legitimize their claims. In ancient thought, the possession of a divine king's remains conferred authority. To allow the body to rot, or to delay the embalming for fear of uncertainty, would have been unthinkable. The embalmers were therefore under immense pressure to act swiftly. Even if doubts lingered, hesitation was not an option. And so they proceeded. Honey sealed the tissues. Cedar oil perfumed the air. Myrrh and frankincense burned in the chamber. Linen bound the limbs. What they created was not only the preserved body of a king, but a symbol, an eternal relic that later generations would use as proof of Alexander's immortality. Visitors centuries later would look upon his face and swear that he had conquered death itself. But beneath that miracle lay a possibility far darker, that the preservation which inspired awe across the ancient world was born not from divinity, but from a mistake, the embalming of a man who was not yet fully dead. The horrific timing of Alexander's preservation is one of history's most chilling mysteries. Was his incorruptible body the result of divine favor, brilliant embalming, or the silent suffering of a man entombed in paralysis? The ancient world could never know, but the shadow of that possibility haunts his legend still. As Alexander lay motionless in the palace at Babylon, his generals gathered in whispered councils, their faces lit by oil lamps flickering in the heavy summer air. The greatest army in the world waited outside the palace walls, tens of thousands of men who had followed Alexander across deserts and rivers, who had crowned him with victories. But now, with their king silent, the empire trembled on the edge of collapse. The immediate question was simple, yet devastating. Who would inherit the throne? Alexander's empire had no precedent. It stretched from Greece to India, held together not by institutions or laws, but by the sheer magnetism of his command. Without him, the fragile structure threatened to shatter into fragments. Some generals insisted that the unborn child of his wife Roxana should inherit, though it was not yet even known whether she carried a son. Others turned their eyes to Alexander's half-brother Archidaeus, a man of limited intellect and questionable capacity to rule. Still others argued for themselves, each convinced they were the strongest, the most deserving. The air in the palace filled with suspicion and ambition. And through it all, Alexander may have listened. According to ancient accounts, even as his body failed, his mind remained awake. Imagine the torment. If this is true, to lie there, unable to move, and hear your life's work divided like plunder at a feast. To hear your most trusted companions debating whether to honor your legacy or carve it into pieces. Plutarch records that at one point, a general asked Alexander directly to whom he left his empire. The king's lips moved faintly. Some claimed he whispered to the strongest. Others doubted he had said anything intelligible at all. If he truly suffered from paralysis of the chest and vocal cords, as Guillain-Barré syndrome suggests, he may have been unable to speak clearly. Those words, immortalized in legend, may have been the invention of ambitious men, eager to cloak their power grabs in the authority of a dying king. But the uncertainty was enough. Within hours of his supposed death, rivalries hardened into factions. Perdiccas, one of Alexander's closest officers, attempted to hold the empire together, ruling in the name of Roxana's unborn child. Yet, others like Ptolemy Seleucus and Antigonus already dreamed of carving out kingdoms of their own. The funeral rites, instead of offering closure, became the first act in decades of bloodshed. Outside the palace, Alexander's soldiers demanded to see their king one last time. When the doors opened and his body was displayed, they filed past in silence, thousands of men, each expecting to find a corpse ravaged by fever. Instead, they saw a figure that looked almost alive, serene, uncorrupted, godlike. Some fell to their knees, believing he had transcended mortality. Others touched his hand, swearing they felt warmth. The spectacle cemented the belief that Alexander was not merely a man, but a being touched by the divine. For the generals, this was both a gift and a curse. To control his body meant to control his legacy. Whoever possessed Alexander's corpse would wield immense symbolic power for the army, and the people believed that where Alexander lay, there too lay the authority to rule. Thus, the political battle shifted from succession to possession. His generals were no longer arguing only about territory or titles, they were arguing over Alexander's very body. A body that might still have contained the flicker of life if the dreadful theory of misdiagnosis is true. The irony is brutal. Alexander, who once orchestrated the movements of entire armies with flawless precision, now lay still while others maneuvered around him. The man who had united East and West in one colossal empire became the silent center of a storm that would tear that empire apart. In those days of confusion, as plots formed and loyalties fractured, the conqueror of the known world may have been forced to listen helplessly, while his companions, men who owed everything to him, dismantled his legacy piece by piece. No great man dies without whispers of conspiracy, and Alexander was no exception. Almost from the moment his agony began at the banquet in Babylon, rumors spread like wildfire through the palace halls and soldier camps. Could such a sudden and inexplicable collapse have been natural, or had someone somewhere slipped a poison into his wine? The theory was irresistible. Alexander was not merely a king, but the pivot upon which the entire known world turned. His death would create opportunities for power-hungry generals, disaffected courtiers, even foreign enemies who longed to see the empire fracture. To many, the simplest explanation was murder. Ancient sources fed this suspicion. Some chroniclers suggested that Antipater, the regent left behind in Macedonia, feared Alexander's wrath and arranged his death from afar. Others accused the ambitious generals at his side, men like Cassander or even Perdiccas who stood to gain from his absence. The most dramatic tale blamed his cupbearer Iolaus, claiming he had delivered the fatal drink during the banquet. But the poison theory faced problems. For one, Alexander's decline was not immediate. Accounts describe nearly 2 weeks of progressive illness. Fever, abdominal pain, then paralysis. Most known poisons of the ancient world, deadly plants like hemlock, aconite, or strychnine worked swiftly, not slowly. A man of Alexander's size and constitution would not linger for days if struck by a single dose. Still, modern toxicologists have weighed in. Some point to white hellebore, a plant that could cause violent vomiting, abdominal pain, and progressive weakness. In carefully administered doses, it might mimic the symptoms described. Others have proposed arsenic or lead exposure toxins that could cause neurological damage. Yet, none fit perfectly. The pattern of paralysis and the preservation of mental clarity align more closely with disease than with poison. And yet, the allure of conspiracy remains strong. Alexander was not an ordinary man. He was the linchpin of an empire. Every general, every satrap, every courtier knew that his death would ignite a succession crisis. The timing of his collapse, just as he prepared for another campaign, this time against Arabia, was too convenient for some to accept as coincidence. In the fevered atmosphere of Babylon, paranoia flourished. Soldiers whispered that their king had been struck down by jealous gods. Priests muttered of curses carried from India, revenge for temples desecrated. Rivals accused one another in veiled language, each seeking to deflect suspicion. The line between poison disease and divine retribution blurred into myth. What makes the poison theory enduring is not its medical plausibility, but its political resonance. The image of Alexander murdered by his own companions captures the betrayal and fragmentation that followed his death. It foreshadows the wars of the Diadochi, when brother-in-arms turn sword against sword in the scramble for power. But if modern medicine is right, and Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, then the poison theory collapses. He was not murdered by a cupbearer or a rival, but by his own body, betrayed by an illness no one could have understood. In that sense, the poison may not have been poured from a cup, but hidden in the invisible workings of his immune system. Still, the suspicion mattered. In the unstable days after his collapse, the belief that Alexander had been poisoned hardened distrust among his generals. It fueled ambition, justified betrayals, and provided a convenient explanation for his death. Whether true or not, the idea of poison became another weapon in the political struggle that would soon tear the empire apart. For Alexander himself, if he was aware, as the theory of locked-in syndrome suggests, the whispers of poison may have reached his ears as he lay helpless. Imagine hearing your companions argue not about how to save you, but about who might have killed you. To be the world's greatest conqueror, and yet unable to defend yourself against accusation or plot that was the final humiliation. With Alexander declared dead, preparations began for a funeral that would reflect his unparalleled stature. The greatest conqueror of the age could not be interred in haste. His body preserved in oils, honey, and linen was to be placed in a magnificent funerary carriage, a rolling monument in itself, destined for Macedonia, where kings of his house were laid to rest. The funeral cortege was a spectacle of wealth and symbolism. Ancient accounts describe a massive chariot adorned with golden statues, painted panels, and a canopy studded with jewels. It was less a bier than a moving temple, pulled by teams of horses across the dusty roads of the Near East. Soldiers lined the route. Crowds gathered to glimpse the passing relic of a man who had seemed larger than life. The journey was to take months crossing deserts and rivers before finally delivering Alexander to his ancestral home. But destiny had other plans, for among Alexander's generals, one man recognized that to possess the conqueror's body was to possess his legacy. Ptolemy, a seasoned commander who had fought alongside Alexander from the earliest campaigns, understood the political power bound up in a corpse worshipped as divine. He did not intend for that corpse to return to Macedonia. In a bold stroke, Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession in Syria. His forces, well prepared and disciplined, seized the elaborate carriage and diverted it southward toward Egypt. The Macedonian guards were overwhelmed, unable to resist the determination of a general who had already set his sights on building a kingdom of his own. This was no mere theft. In the ancient world, to control the body of a king was to control his spirit. Whoever buried Alexander could claim to be his rightful heir in spirit, if not in blood. For Ptolemy, bringing Alexander's body to Egypt meant binding his own dynasty to the conqueror's divine aura. It was a political act disguised as piety, one of the most audacious gambits in history. The procession wound its way into Egypt, where Ptolemy established himself as ruler. He built Alexandria into his capital, and in the heart of that city he enshrined Alexander's remains. The act achieved two things at once. It rooted Ptolemy's authority in the sanctity of Alexander's memory, and it transformed Alexandria into a city of pilgrimage, a place where rulers and commoners alike could look upon the preserved conqueror. For the men left behind in Babylon and Macedonia, Ptolemy's theft was both infuriating and brilliant. Deprived of Alexander's body, they lost a symbol that might have united the fractured empire. For Ptolemy, however, it secured legitimacy and set the foundation of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would endure for nearly 3 centuries, culminating in the reign of Cleopatra. The hijacking of Alexander's funeral changed the course of history. It meant that his body, perhaps still lifelike, preserved in uncanny perfection, would rest not in Macedon among his ancestors, but in Egypt among the pharaohs. There, his incorruptible form became both sacred relic and political weapon. Imagine the spectacle, a golden carriage meant for Macedonia suddenly veering into the deserts of Egypt, bearing a body that inspired awe and dread. The greatest conqueror who had dreamed of uniting East and West would now lie in Alexandria, his remains serving the ambitions of men who had once called him brother in arms. Alexander had commanded armies across continents, yet in death, he could not command the direction of his own funeral. His body, revered as semi-divine, became the prize of the living, seized not by enemies, but by his closest companion turned rival. When Ptolemy seized Alexander's body and brought it to Egypt, he understood that possession alone was not enough. To secure his rule, he needed a shrine that would awe the world. Thus began the creation of one of antiquity's most extraordinary mausoleums, the Golden Tomb of Alexandria. Ancient sources describe a structure unlike anything the Mediterranean had seen. The tomb was designed not only as a place of rest, but as a symbol of divine kingship. Its walls gleamed with imported stone, polished smooth as glass. Chambers were adorned with panels of gold inlaid with ivory and precious stones gathered from the farthest reaches of Alexander's empire. Torches burned with aromatic resins, filling the air with the sweet scent of cedar and myrrh. At the heart of the mausoleum lay Alexander's sarcophagus. Originally, it was said to be cast in solid gold, a fitting vessel for a man worshipped as a god. But later rulers coveting the treasure replaced it with crystal or glass, allowing visitors to gaze directly upon the preserved body within. Imagine stepping into the chamber the conqueror lay beneath a translucent lid, his features still lifelike, as if he might awaken at any moment. For centuries, pilgrims came to see him awestruck by the illusion of immortality. The tomb itself was more than a resting place. It was a political theatre. By enshrining Alexander in Alexandria, Ptolemy tied his dynasty to the conqueror's legend. The city became a magnet for power and pilgrimage. Kings, generals, and even emperors made the journey to stand before Alexander's body. Some, like Augustus Caesar, reportedly placed crowns upon his head and flowers at his feet. To touch Alexander was to borrow some measure of his divine authority. Architecturally, the tomb was astonishing in its sophistication. Engineers designed elaborate ventilation shafts to maintain stable temperature and humidity, preventing decay. Drainage systems carried away moisture, while walls lined with antimicrobial substances slowed the spread of rot. What modern archaeology has revealed in other Ptolemaic sites suggests that these techniques were far ahead of their time. The mausoleum of Alexander was not just a monument of wealth, but of science, the culmination of centuries of Egyptian expertise applied to a Macedonian king. The effect on the people of Alexandria was profound. For them, Alexander was not a distant memory, but a tangible presence. Festivals honored his memory. Foreign envoys were brought before his tomb as proof that the city housed the greatest relic in the world. Children grew up knowing that only streets away the conqueror of Asia still lay in eternal rest. Yet this reverence was not without irony. The man who had marched tirelessly across continents, never content with one capital or one crown, was now bound to a single chamber. His body, preserved so perfectly, became both a wonder and a prisoner. Generations came to stare upon him, but he himself remained forever silent. Reduced to symbol and spectacle, the golden tomb of Alexandria turned Alexander into something more than a memory. It made him eternal in the eyes of the ancient world. His preserved body was no longer just the remains of a man, but the embodiment of empire divinity and unyielding power. For centuries, that chamber glittered with offerings and echoed with the footsteps of those who came seeking inspiration, legitimacy, or simply awe. But as dazzling as the tomb was, its fate would prove as mysterious as Alexander's death itself. For though it stood as one of the wonders of the ancient Mediterranean, the golden tomb would in time vanish from history, leaving behind only whispers, fragments, and the haunting question of where Alexander's body lies today. For generations after his death, Alexander's tomb in Alexandria was not a silent crypt, but a living stage. His preserved body, displayed beneath crystal, became the centerpiece of rituals, ceremonies, and imperial pilgrimages. To stand before him was to feel the weight of history pressing down, as though the conqueror still cast his shadow across the world. Roman emperors in particular were captivated. Julius Caesar, upon visiting Alexandria, is said to have gazed long at Alexander's body, struck by the contrast between the empire the Macedonian had carved in a mere decade and the slower conquest Caesar himself pursued. Augustus too could not resist. Sources claim that when he stood before the preserved form, he placed a golden crown upon Alexander's head and scattered flowers at his feet. One account even whispers that Augustus reached out to touch the body's nose, a gesture so startling that it lingered in rumor for centuries. These were not mere curiosities. In the ancient world, incorruptibility was a sign of divinity. Saints, pharaohs, and heroes were judged by the state of their remains. A body that resisted decay meant the gods had claimed it, sanctifying it as proof of the divine. Alexander's lifelike appearance centuries after death convinced many that he was not simply a man who had conquered the world, but a being whose flesh defied mortality. The legend grew with each retelling. Travelers described how his skin seemed to glow faintly, how his hair retained its form, how even the folds of his garments appeared untouched by time. To behold him was not only to see a corpse, but to confront the illusion of life itself. Visitors left convinced that Alexander's spirit lingered within, watching silently through the glass immortal, even in death. The Ptolemies, who had built their dynasty upon his legacy, used this belief shrewdly. They allowed foreign dignitaries to view the tomb, charging tribute for the privilege. The sight of Alexander preserved became both political theatre and economic boon. Each crown laid upon him, each sacrifice burned in his honor, strengthened the aura of Alexandria as a city blessed by gods. For the common people too, the tomb was a place of pilgrimage. Sailors arriving in the harbor made offerings to Alexander before embarking again, seeking his protection for their voyages. Merchants prayed before his likeness for success in trade. Even scholars from the great library of Alexandria are said to have drawn inspiration from his presence, seeing in his preservation proof that knowledge, like empire, could transcend time. But beneath the reverence lurked unease. To look upon a man preserved so perfectly was also to feel the uncanny chill of death cheated. Whispers circulated that perhaps he had never truly died, that something unnatural had been done to keep him suspended between worlds. For some, he was a god. For others, a ghost. For all, his presence was undeniable. The legend of Alexander's incorruptible body fed into the larger myth of his life. A man destined for greatness from birth, who defied the odds at every turn, who united east and west, and who in death refused to yield to decay. Whether preserved by divine fire, by Egyptian science, or by the horrific possibility of premature embalming, Alexander became the embodiment of eternity. And yet, this eternity was fragile. For though emperors and pilgrims walked in awe around his crystal coffin, the tomb itself was not immune to the chaos of history. Wars, revolts, and earthquakes would in time erase its traces. But while it stood, the golden tomb and the preserved conqueror within shaped the imagination of the ancient world, leaving behind a legend that outlasted even stone. For centuries, Alexander's golden tomb stood at the heart of Alexandria, a place where emperors and pilgrims alike came to witness the conqueror who would not decay. But history, as relentless as time itself, eventually swallowed the shrine. By the late Roman era, the once celebrated mausoleum began to fade from records. And then, as if the earth itself conspired to guard the secret, it vanished. Ancient writers offer tantalizing glimpses of its decline. We hear of emperors plundering parts of the tomb, one seizing the golden sarcophagus to mint coins, another replacing it with crystal or alabaster. The more the body was exposed to political manipulation, the more the tomb lost its sanctity. In time, the rituals that once honored Alexander became routine spectacles, stripped of reverence and fed by greed. then silence. By the 4th century AD, mentions of the tomb grow scarce. Some historians believe earthquakes shook Alexandria, collapsing structures in the royal quarter. Others suspect religious upheaval played a role as Christianity rose to dominance and pagan cults were suppressed. A tomb that had once symbolized divine kingship may have been deliberately obscured or even destroyed. What makes the mystery more profound is that Alexandria itself shifted like sand under centuries of conquest. Fires ravaged the city. War battered its walls. The shoreline moved, burying ruins beneath layers of silt and stone. By the time medieval travelers sought Alexander's body, the tomb was already a legend, its location lost beneath centuries of urban sprawl. And yet, the search never stopped. Over 140 documented expeditions from Roman times to the modern era have claimed to hunt for the lost mausoleum. Each promised to reveal Alexander's final resting place. None succeeded. In Egypt, officials catalogued dozens of sites of interest, from catacombs to palaces, but each yielded only fragments, never the body itself. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeology matured into science, the hunt intensified. Excavations in Alexandria uncovered remnants of the ancient royal quarter shards of temples and colossal statues, but no trace of the crystal coffin. Frustration mounted. Was the tomb buried beneath the modern city, inaccessible beneath streets and homes? Or had it been moved in antiquity, spirited away to protect it from looters, perhaps hidden in the desert? Even in recent years, hints have surfaced. In 2019, archaeologist Calliope Limnaeos Papacosta announced the discovery of marble statues and underground structures in Alexandria's royal quarter. Radar scans revealed anomalies that might conceal chambers. Soil samples hinted at residues of honey and resin, the very materials used in embalming. But the conclusive find, the body itself, remains elusive. What drives the search even after 2 millennia is not only curiosity, but the possibility of revelation. If Alexander's body were found preserved, as ancient witnesses described, it could transform both archaeology and medicine. Soft tissue might still hold secrets of his health, his lineage, even the truth of his final illness. The greatest puzzle of antiquity could be answered in the flick of a genetic test. Yet, the tomb remains stubbornly hidden. Perhaps it lies beneath a bustling Alexandria neighborhood, too deep to reach, without uprooting an entire city. Perhaps it rests beneath the harbor, swallowed by the sea, when earthquakes and tsunamis reshaped the coast. Or perhaps in the chaos of the late Roman world, it was destroyed and lost forever, leaving only memory. The lost tomb of Alexander is not merely an archaeological question. It is a ghost that haunts history, a reminder that even the greatest conqueror can vanish into silence. His body once drew emperors to their knees, yet today we cannot even say where he lies. The irony is brutal. Alexander, who once made the world his empire, has become history's most famous missing person. The disappearance of Alexander's tomb might have remained a legend, sealed away by time, had modern science not developed tools that seem almost miraculous compared to the crude methods of antiquity. Where Roman officials once relied on torchlight and rumor, today archaeologists wield ground-penetrating radar chemical analysis and satellite imagery. These instruments have pulled back the veil of centuries, revealing tantalizing traces of a lost world beneath Alexandria's crowded streets. In recent decades, surveys of the city's ancient royal quarter have revealed underground anomalies, chambers and corridors aligned with descriptions from ancient texts. Radar sweeps show voids hidden below layers of stone and rubble voids that may once have housed royal mausoleums. Electromagnetic mapping uncovers metallic signatures that some speculate could be remnants of the golden sarcophagus once described by historians. Soil analysis adds another layer of intrigue. Samples taken from suspected sites have revealed traces of honey, cedar oil, myrrh, and cassia. These are not random residues. They match precisely the substances ancient writers described as central to Alexander's embalming. Honey, with its natural antibacterial qualities, was the cornerstone of preservation. Cedar oil and resins acted as both antiseptic and perfume, sealing the body from decay. To find these traces lingering in the earth after 2 millennia suggests that somewhere nearby the embalmers once worked their art. Chemical analysis has even confirmed concentrations of rare aromatic compounds that could only have been imported at vast expense. Such materials were reserved for kings, for pharaohs, for the divine. To find them in Alexandria strengthens the belief that Alexander's body, once enshrined there, left behind a chemical fingerprint, a ghostly trace of the conqueror's final preparations. Meanwhile, archaeologists experiment with reconstructing ancient methods. By applying honey oils and resins to preserved remains under controlled conditions, they have demonstrated just how effective these techniques could be. Bodies treated in this way resist decay, far beyond expectations, lending weight to the accounts of Alexander's incorruptibility. What once seemed myth now appears entirely possible, rooted not in divine intervention, but in the extraordinary science of ancient embalmers. Modern medicine also continues to re-examine Alexander's final illness. Specialists compare the progression of his symptoms with known diseases, running scenarios that test the plausibility of poison malaria typhoid and Guillain-Barré syndrome. Clinical case studies reveal how closely his condition mirrors locked-in paralysis and how easily ancient physicians relying on breath and movement alone could have mistaken it for death. The chilling possibility remains. Science suggests Alexander was not only preserved, but preserved alive. And yet, for all the advances, the tomb itself eludes discovery. Alexandria is a living city, built layer upon layer over the ruins of its past. To excavate deeply is to uproot modern neighborhoods, to tear apart streets and homes. Much of the royal quarter lies submerged beneath the Mediterranean, shifted by earthquakes and swallowed by the sea. Radar may reveal hidden shapes, but the waters conceal them, still mocking every attempt at certainty. The search for Alexander's body has become a quest, not just of archaeology, but of identity. For Egypt, it promises immense cultural and economic power, a find rivaling even the tomb of Tutankhamun. For historians, it holds the key to confirming legends long doubted. For medicine, it offers a unique chance to examine the remains of a man whose death straddles the line between myth and science. But until the coffin is found, until the body itself is revealed, all that remains are fragments, chemical whispers in the soil radar shadows beneath the streets. Stories written by ancient hands. Alexander's final secret endures, waiting for the day when modern science can open a chamber long sealed and confront whatever truth lies within. History often leaves us with puzzles, but few are as disturbing as the final mystery of Alexander the Great. Was he truly dead when the ancient physicians declared it, or was he trapped inside his own body, silent, paralyzed, yet fully conscious? The possibility drawn from both eyewitness accounts and modern medical analysis transforms Alexander's death from a simple tragedy into one of the most haunting enigmas in all of history. To the men who stood at his bedside, Alexander seemed gone. His breath was faint, perhaps undetectable by their crude methods. His chest hardly moved. His limbs lay stiff and lifeless. His voice, once thunderous, was reduced to nothing more than whispers, and soon not even that. In the language of 323 BC, he was dead. But by the understanding of modern medicine, he may have been alive, locked within his own flesh, unable to signal the truth. Consider the silence that followed his supposed last words. When asked who should inherit his empire, he may have tried to respond, but paralysis made his tongue heavy, his lips uncooperative. What later chroniclers recorded as "to the strongest" might have been the invention of those eager to seize power. Imagine the cruelty of it. Alexander's empire, built over a decade of ceaseless campaigning, shattered because his generals mistook silence for consent. Wars of succession, the carving of kingdoms, the deaths of tens of thousands, all might have sprung from a misdiagnosis. Even more chilling is what followed. His body, laid out in the blazing heat of Babylon, showed no signs of decay. For 6 days, witnesses swore his skin remained unblemished, his features lifelike. Soldiers filed past, many of them falling to their knees, convinced their king had transcended death and become divine. Some reached out to touch him, certain they felt warmth. They believed they were honoring a god. But if modern theory is correct, they may have been touching a man who still lived, faintly breathing, silently aware, enduring the horror of being worshipped as a corpse. The embalmers, pressed into service by politics and necessity, saw what they thought was a miracle. They began their sacred work, honey, to preserve the flesh, resins to perfume the air oils, to sanctify the body. But if Alexander was not truly dead, then every incision, every ritual, every touch was performed on a man who could still feel. The world's greatest conqueror, unable to cry out, may have experienced his own preservation in agonizing clarity. This possibility redefines his incorruptibility. Ancient chroniclers saw his lifelike preservation as proof of divinity, a sign that the gods refused to let his body decay. But modern medicine offers another explanation. His incorruptibility may have been the result of premature embalming applied before death had fully taken hold. The conqueror of empires may have endured the ultimate humiliation, embalmed alive, transformed into an eternal relic, not by godly favor, but by human error. What does this say about history itself? If one of the most documented deaths in antiquity was in fact a misdiagnosis, how many others were? How often did ancient physicians mistake paralysis for death, silence for absence, stillness for the grave? The case of Alexander raises questions, not just about one man's fate, but about the fragility of human perception. Without the tools of modern science, how many lives were ended prematurely, how many voices silenced while still aware? And yet this haunting theory is also what keeps Alexander's story alive. His empire collapsed into chaos within days of his supposed death. The wars of the Diadochi reshaped the ancient world, creating the Hellenistic kingdoms that spread Greek culture far and wide. But behind the grand sweep of history lies the possibility of a single, agonizing mistake. If Alexander's generals misread his condition, then the course of civilizations was altered not by strategy or destiny, but by a moment of medical failure. The lost tomb adds another layer of torment. For centuries, emperors and pilgrims gazed upon his preserved body in Alexandria, swearing he looked as if he might wake at any moment. Today, we cannot even say where he lies. His tomb, once one of the most famous in the world, has vanished. Modern science longs for the chance to examine his remains, to test tissue and bone for clues to confirm or deny the theory that he was embalmed alive. But until the tomb is found, the answer remains locked in darkness. And so we are left with the haunting question: did Alexander die peacefully, as some sources suggest, fading into silence after fever and exhaustion? Or did he endure something far worse? Days of awareness, unable to move, unable to breathe, watching helplessly as his friends and enemies alike prepared his body for eternity. Was the man who never lost a battle defeated at last, not by a sword or an empire, but by the terrible prison of his own flesh? This is the paradox of Alexander's death. He remains immortal in legend, revered as the greatest conqueror the world has ever seen. And yet his final legacy may not be his victories, but his vulnerability. The reminder that even the strongest are fragile, even the most divine are human, and even the greatest can be undone, not by their enemies, but by their own bodies. Perhaps we will never know the truth. Perhaps his secret will lie buried forever, along with his tomb beneath the shifting stones of Alexandria. But in that uncertainty lies his immortality. For Alexander's final conquest was not of nations or kings, it was of memory itself. More than 2,000 years later, we are still captivated, still unsettled, still asking the same question: what truly happened in those final days in Babylon? The answer may remain elusive, but the mystery ensures that Alexander the Great, in death as in life, continues to rule our imagination.